Hi everyone. In this short video, I'm going to walk you through the drama unit writing exam. Our focus in this walkthrough is to point out some things that you'll need to be aware of as you're making your way through the exam, including some things that I want you to do, particularly pertaining to part one, which is a bit of a departure, but not too much of a departure from some things that you've done in the previous two writing exams. Before we get started with all of that, though, a couple of quick things. First, I just want to remind you how very, very important it is to read the instructions very carefully for each part of the exam to make sure that you don't miss any details with regard to word count or to how you're supposed to select your answers, because in this particular exam, specifically with regard to part two and part three, there are specific instructions regarding how you can select the the questions that you're going to answer in the exam. So be really watchful about those instructions, particularly again in parts one and two. Now, part one is actually really where I want to spend most of my time in this brief discussion, because part one is the most active part of the exam. It is the most involved part of the exam. I suspect it is going to take you the longest time in completing the exam. And so right out the gate, the first thing I'm going to tell you or suggest that you do with regard to part one is make sure that you plot out a sufficient amount of time to tackle part one. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, there are 7 questions to part one, and you are expected to answer all of those questions. These questions represent themes, characters, and ideas that across the 4 plays that we looked at in the drama unit really are crucial or central to demonstrating your understanding of the plays themselves. So they are required, each and every one of them, to again show me how well you've understood the plays and really what they're all about. The other thing that's important with regard to these questions is that these are all comparative in nature, with the exception of the very last question. And essentially, you're going to be comparing either a couple of plays in each question or 2 or more characters in a question. And so you'll want to be very mindful of several things with regard to how you approach your responses to those questions. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But the last thing I want to mention before we get a closer look at my suggestions for completing this part of the exam is one other way to prepare for this part of the exam. And that is to go through each question, read through them, and with each one, jot down your initial ideas, thoughts, notes in general. Take some time to build each of your answers. Don't answer them quickly. Build them, revise them, and refine them. These are worth a lot of points, as you can see. In fact, this part of the exam is worth 2/3 of the entire points possible for the exam. So you don't want to rush through these questions. You want to take some time. So I strongly recommend that you play with your answers, build some initial ideas and thoughts, then go back and construct your answer, and go back a 3rd time to make sure that you've done all the things that you need to with regard to answering the prompt in full, and that you've also sufficiently built your answer in terms of examples, passages, and so forth. So make sure again to take your time in this part of the exam. All right, so the other things that I want to talk about with regard to part one are the bullet points that you see here. These are absolute must-haves, things that you need to be thinking about and making sure that you either do or don't do as you build your answers. Make sure that plot summary is used to an absolute minimum in your responses. Plot summary isn't helping you answer your question, it's actually really doing the opposite. So whenever you use plot details in your answers, make them very specific, keep them brief, and make sure that you connect them very clearly to an idea that you're presenting in your overall response. Absolutely do not engage in personal response in any of your answers. If I wanted you to tell me about your personal thoughts about any of these texts, I would ask you. So don't engage in personal response in your overall answers. The third bullet point is really, really important too. In fact, it's probably one of the most important things to keep in mind as you build your answer. And that is to make sure that you equally discuss each play or character that's mentioned in the question in order to create a balanced answer. Don't overload about one play or one character and give yourself very little space to talk about the other play or the other character in the rest of your answer. Make sure that you evenly distribute your attention to all of the characters or all of the plays that are mentioned in the question that you're answering. You'll also want to make sure too, with the fourth bullet point, that you've addressed each part of the prompt in your answer. And again, try to do so as equally as you can. So before you submit this exam, go back to the questions you're answering and make sure that your answer is actually answering the question. Do some double checking so that, again, you're constructing solid, strong answers that are going to perform well in the exam. Lastly, I'm going to recommend that with each answer in part one, that you start with a specific one sentence answer to the prompt, a sentence that basically embodies your thesis statement for your overall answer. This is going to help in a couple of ways. One, it's going to orient me as the reader to each answer to your main idea. So I'm not going to have to dig for it or look for it, maybe find it buried in the middle of the paragraph. The other thing that it's going to help to do is it's going to help you because it's going to articulate clearly what your position is. And I do recommend that you consider building this specific one sentence thesis statement after you've experimented and played with your answer. Don't come up with the thesis statement until after you've explored the ideas that you're being asked to think about in each of the prompts that you're working through. Make sure to refine that one sentence answer that opens your response so that it's as strong and as sharp as possible. So these are my major recommendations for part one. For parts 2 and 3, we're going to be talking about something that's rather familiar, but I do want to spend just another minute or so talking to you about parts 2 and 3. This is where, if you remember a moment ago, I talked about the importance of paying attention to the instructions in each of these two parts. Part 2, you're going to be doing those character explications, the IDES character analysis. Note the following, that you cannot pick more than one character from the same play. So be very aware of those particular restrictions to how you approach part 2. And the other thing that I want to mention with regard to part 2 and with the IDES formula is the following. Remember that identify has to do with establishing whether the character is a major character, a minor character, a protagonist, an antagonist, a flat character, a round character, etc. You can also even establish who the character is in relation to the other characters in the play. The D is really important in that what you do specifically in D is basically use adjectives. I want you to define the character through adjectives. Identify the 3 or 4 adjectives that you think best describe this character's personality. If you're describing plot points or parts of the plot, you're not actually defining the character. Think of adjectives, the way that you would describe, for example, your sister or brother, your grandmother or grandfather to somebody. We use adjectives to describe them, like funny, flighty, serious, active, energetic. Those are adjectives, and that's what I want you to think about with the D. As for explain, explain has to do with identifying the 2 or 3 central actions that the character is involved in, performs, or is impacted by, perhaps even a decision that the character makes that are key or central to understanding and reflecting who this character really is. Again, this is not about plot summary. This is about focusing on specific things that the character does or says perhaps, or maybe is impacted by, that is significant to our overall understanding of the character. Finally is the S, and the S, remember, has to do with specifying themes. And in this regard, again, like with the explaining significant events, I want you to think about 2 or 3 specific themes that are tied to the character. And this is not, once more, a place to give me more plot summary, as it is an opportunity to connect the events or actions that you've talked about in the E section with specific ideas or arguments. One way to think about it is I've identified or talked about a specific event. The S is my opportunity to explain what that event signifies or represents, why it's important. So when we talk about themes, we're talking about things like identifying, like with Medea, a significant theme to Medea, for example, to our character Medea, is motherhood. But another significant theme to her is also the theme of being a wife and a foreigner, and what it means to be a wife, a woman subjected to the double standard. So you want to think about arguments that are attached to the particular character, and those are your themes. And think about the 2 or 3 themes or arguments that are most central to the character that you're analyzing. So finally is the passage explications. And all I need to say here to wrap things up is to make sure that you use these 4 reminders here, A, B, C, and D, as you build your passage explications. And finally, to notice that all you have to do is explicate 2 passages here, one from category A and one from category B. Be very aware that I do not want to see 2 passage explications from category A or 2 passage explications from category B, one from each. So just make sure that you follow that instruction. Other than that, you should be able to approach or address your your passage explications using that A, B, C, D at the beginning with the instructions to help kind of guide and shape your explication. And remember, as with the rest of the answers that you give in this exam, it's not about engaging in plot summary or personal response. It's about being specific and clear and making sure that you give what the question is asking you to give. So those are my kind of suggestions and tips for completing this exam. The last thing that I'm going to suggest as you make your way through this exam, you'll have until Monday, October 5th by midnight to complete this exam. I do recommend that you do, if you can, a kind of divide and conquer approach, which is do a little bit of this exam every day so that you're not trying to do it all at once. And especially, again, going back to the comparative analysis, make sure that you set aside a fair chunk of time to work through part 1 as carefully and as thoroughly as possible. All right, so good luck with the exam. I hope that you're able to tackle it successfully. I will be out of town for the majority of the weekend, so I will be limited in my access to the internet in terms of responding to questions. So I will try to get to questions if you have any. But again, best of luck with the exam, and I look forward to seeing what you do with it.